London, 1823. There are women who enter a drawing room as if it were a battlefield, and others who enter as if it were a stage. Miss Elowen Hartley entered as if it were a map. Not a map of streets, though she knew London well enough to instruct a coachman without hesitation, but a map of people, of inclinations, of glances exchanged too quickly, of smiles held a beat too long, of silences that meant more than any compliment. She had learned early that the heart could be managed best when it was managed from afar. It was a doctrine she did not preach with severity, but lived with ease, like a woman who keeps her gloves clean by never touching what might stain them. At 26, Elowen had survived the usual hazards of society, the flattery of a man with poor intentions, the pity of a woman with none, and the boredom of half a dozen gentlemen who believed conversation was something that happened to them, not something they joined. She had refused proposals without cruelty. She had declined affection without theatrics. And she had done it all with that calm, assured air that made older matrons either admire her discipline or resent her freedom. "She's so composed," they said, with admiration that sounded suspiciously like complaint. "She's too composed," they said, with complaint that sounded suspiciously like fear. Elowen herself was quite content with the reputation. A woman who appeared untroubled by love was treated, in London, with the curious caution one reserves for an expensive vase, admired, discussed, and kept at a careful distance. Tonight, however, distance was precisely what Elowen enjoyed. The ballroom at Lady Trowbridge's townhouse was alive with music and movement, with candlelight trembling in crystal and satin skirts whispering like secrets across the polished floor. A duke stood somewhere near the card tables, laughing with the tolerant patience of a man who knew everyone wanted something from him. A duchess, beautifully bored, watched the room as if evaluating which young woman might eventually survive the duties of her title. London was full of this sort of theatre. Elowen was full of the quiet satisfaction of understanding it. She stood near the edge of the dance floor beside a marble column, her fan resting against her palm. She did not need it for air. She used it the way she used most things, with intention. Her cousins were nearby, clustered like bright, hopeful birds. Miss Clara Renford, all blush and optimism, adjusted her ribbon again and again, as though the perfect bow might summon the perfect man. Miss Ivy Renford, sharp-eyed, amused, and not at all fooled by compliments, sipped lemonade and watched the gentleman like a naturalist studying a rare species. They were Elowen's family by affection, if not by strict proximity of blood. Their mothers had been inseparable. Their households had been connected by years of visits, letters, and shared opinions about society that were too honest to be spoken aloud. And because the Renford girls were young enough to still believe love might be arranged neatly, and Elowen was old enough to believe feelings could be guided like a carriage through crowded streets, the role had been decided without ceremony. Elowen became, gradually, the architect of their romance. She did not call herself a matchmaker, of course. That would have sounded vulgar, like a woman who sold outcomes. Elowen merely noticed things. She noticed that Clara's laugh was soft and frequent around Mr. Holden, the charming second son with the dimples and the alarming confidence. She noticed that Ivy's eyes narrowed, in the most interesting way, whenever Captain Rowley spoke with that earnest sincerity that made foolish girls swoon and sensible girls suspicious. She noticed that men, as a general rule, performed better when they believed themselves clever. And she noticed, most crucially, that society was easier to navigate when you were the one arranging the paths. "Elowen," Clara murmured, leaning close. "Do you think Mr. Holden will ask me to dance?" Elowen's gaze slid toward Mr. Holden at once. He stood near the refreshments, laughing too loudly at someone's joke, and already turning his head as if he felt watched. "He will," Elowen said gently, "but do not look at him when he approaches." Clara blinked. "Why?" Because he is the sort of man who needs to feel chosen, Elwyn replied, as if discussing the weather. Let him believe he has to win your attention. Ivy gave a quiet snort. You talk as though men are puzzles. Elwyn's smile was small, knowing they insist upon it. Clara tried not to look at Mr. Holden. She failed, naturally. Within 3 seconds, Elwyn did not chastise her. She merely shifted her position slightly, as though moving a piece on a chessboard. Stand half a step to the left, she murmured to Clara. Yes, there. Now he must approach you directly instead of drifting. Clara obeyed, and Elwyn felt the familiar, faint pleasure of order taking shape. That pleasure was not love, it was control, and control was safer. Miss Hartley. The voice came from behind her, steady, warm, and quietly amused. Elwyn did not startle. She never startled. She simply turned with the composed grace of a woman who expected to be addressed. Mr. Nathaniel Ashford stood there, looking as though he belonged to the room without trying to dominate it. He was not a duke. He was not even a lord. And yet he carried himself with the ease of a man who had long ago decided he did not need a title to stand comfortably among them. His coat was well tailored, his cravat neatly tied, his hair dark and slightly unruly in a way that suggested he had made peace with imperfection. He had known Elwyn since childhood, through summers in the country, through Christmas gatherings, through the years when grief and joy had woven their families together. He had been the boy who brought her books when she refused to join the noisy games outside. He had been the young man who listened when she spoke, not because she demanded attention, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. And now he was the adult who watched her with the unsettling steadiness of someone who saw behind her poise. "Mr. Ashford," Elwyn said, "you've been avoiding the dance floor." "I might say the same of you," he replied. "I am supervising," she said. "Ah," he murmured. "A high calling." His eyes flicked to Clara, then to Ivy, then back to Elwyn. "I see you've brought your apprentices." "They require guidance," Elwyn said without apology. Nathaniel's mouth curved, but not unkindly. "Or perhaps they require the freedom to make foolish choices and survive them." Elwyn's fan tapped lightly against her palm. "You are sounding dangerously philosophical." "I am merely observing," he said. "You've always preferred to observe, and you've always preferred to comment. Only when it's necessary." He said it softly, but something about his tone suggested he was speaking of more than dance cards and gentlemen with dimples. Elwyn met his gaze, unflinching. If he meant to challenge her, he would have to do it directly. Nathaniel, however, had never been a man of dramatic confrontations. He was the sort of man who waited. And waiting, Elwyn thought, could be a kind of power too. Music swelled, and couples turned in practice patterns. A cluster of young ladies giggled at something a tall gentleman said, though the gentleman did not look as though he had said anything remotely funny. Near the wall, the Duke, there was always a Duke somewhere, glanced toward the dancers, as if deciding whether it was worth stepping into the chaos. Elwyn watched it all, effortlessly. Nathaniel watched her watching. "You've done it again," he said quietly. Elwyn did not pretend ignorance. "Done what?" "Arranged a small miracle," he replied, nodding toward Clara. Mr. Holden had indeed begun moving toward them, drawn as predictably as a moth to candlelight. Clara, remembering Elwyn's instruction, looked away, though her cheeks betrayed her. Mr. Holden approached with a flourish of confidence, bowing as though he were offering Clara not a dance, but a grand destiny. "Miss Renford," he said, "may I claim this set?" Clara's voice trembled just enough to make him feel powerful, but not enough to make her seem foolish. "Yes, Mr. Holden." Elwyn watched him lead Clara away, her steps uncertain at first, then steadying into rhythm. Ivy watched too, expression unreadable. Nathaniel's gaze lingered on Elowen. "You enjoy this," he said. Elowen's answer came easily. "It is satisfying when people are happy." "Yes," Nathaniel agreed, "but you look happiest when you are in control of their happiness." Elowen's smile did not falter, but something inside her shifted, just slightly, like a ribbon pulled tighter. "You speak as though that is a fault." "I speak as though it is a habit," he replied. "And habits are not always faults, but they can become cages." Elowen's fan stilled. She tilted her head, studying him the way she studied the room. Nathaniel Ashford was not flirting. He was not teasing. He was saying something honest. That alone was enough to make Elowen feel, annoyingly, less certain. "There is no cage," she said. "Only preference." Nathaniel's eyes softened. "Is it truly preference, Elowen?" He used her given name when he wanted her to listen. It was an old trick. It worked far too well. Elowen looked away first, which was rare for her. She turned her attention to Ivy, who was now being approached by Captain Rowley, handsome in that open, earnest way that suggested he did not know how dangerous sincerity could be in London. Captain Rowley bowed. Miss Ivy Renford rose one brow. Elowen, sensing the moment, stepped closer. "Captain," Elowen said with calm friendliness, "Ivy was just remarking that she has never seen a man survive Lady Trowbridge's lemon tarts without regret." Captain Rowley laughed. "Then I shall brave them at once, if only to earn Miss Renford's respect." Ivy's lips twitched. Elowen watched the exchange like a conductor listening for harmony. A small nudge here, a well-placed sentence there. Society moved. Hearts drifted. Elowen guided. Nathaniel, beside her, said nothing, but when Captain Rowley offered Ivy his arm toward the refreshments, and Ivy, after a pause long enough to remind him she chose her own steps, accepted, Nathaniel leaned closer. "Tell me," he murmured, "do you ever wonder what it might feel like to be guided?" Elowen's breath caught, faintly, and she hated that it did. She turned back to him, determined to reclaim her steadiness. Nathaniel's expression was gentle, almost teasing, but his eyes held something more, patience, affection, and a kind of quiet sorrow that suggested he had been carrying his feelings with discipline for a very long time. Elowen did not like mysteries that involved her own heart. She preferred mysteries in other people, safer, cleaner, solvable. So she did what she always did when something threatened to disturb her careful balance. She redirected. "Are you staying in London long?" she asked, as though the question were casual. Nathaniel's smile was small. "Long enough." "For what?" He paused, just enough to make her feel the weight of the space between them. Then he said, "For my work, for family, for what must be done." Elowen's fingers tightened around her fan. "Spoken like someone with a secret." "Perhaps," he replied. Elowen's eyes narrowed with polite curiosity. "That is not fair. You know I dislike being kept in ignorance." Nathaniel's gaze held hers, "and yet you keep yourself in it." Elowen's mouth opened, then closed. She had no immediate reply, which was, for Elowen Hartley, a rare and unacceptable sensation. A ripple of laughter erupted near the center of the room, and Elowen turned her head automatically. Clara and Mr. Holden danced, and Clara, sweet, hopeful Clara, looked radiant. Elowen felt a burst of satisfaction. There, evidence that she was right, evidence that her method worked, evidence that feelings could be arranged into something lovely. But even as she watched, a new detail caught her attention. Mr. Holden's smile was dazzling, too dazzling. And when Clara stumbled slightly, he tightened his hold, not to steady her, but to show the room he had her. Elowen's brows smoothed at once. A small thing, a meaningless thing, perhaps. But Elowen did not build opinions on grand declarations. She built them on small things, Nathaniel, noticing her shift, followed her gaze. He said nothing. He did not need to. His silence had always been the most unsettling kind of commentary. Elowen's confidence, which had been so effortless only moments ago, now required effort. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself it was merely the natural strain of an evening full of people. She told herself she was simply tired, but deep inside, beneath the polished surface of her certainty, something else stirred. Not love, not yet, something more inconvenient. Doubt. And doubt, Elowen realized with a strange chill, was far harder to control than any gentleman in a ballroom. As the music changed and the dancers reshuffled, a footman approached Lady Trowbridge with a discreet message. Lady Trowbridge's face brightened with sudden, delighted interest. A moment later, she turned toward the room, raising a hand for attention. "Elowen," Nathaniel murmured, his voice low. "You should listen." Lady Trowbridge's announcement floated over the crowd like perfume. "Ladies and gentlemen, an unexpected honor. His Grace, the Duke of Marroway, has joined us this evening." There was a collective stir. A duke always caused a stir. But Elowen did not immediately look toward the entrance. She watched Clara instead, still glowing, still believing. And she watched Nathaniel beside her, whose eyes had gone suddenly sharp, as though he recognized the name for reasons he did not wish to share. Only then did Elowen turn her head, and when she saw the Duke, tall, composed, and entering the room with that unmistakable ease of power, she felt for the first time in a long while that London had shifted under her feet, not because he was handsome, not because he was a duke, but because the way he looked across the ballroom suggested he had not come merely to be admired. He had come with intent, and intent, Elowen knew, was the beginning of every scandal. By morning, the ballroom existed only as an echo, music reduced to memory, candlelight replaced by a pale wash of winter sun pressing through lace curtains. Elowen hardly woke with the peculiar sensation that something had shifted while she slept. It was not alarm, nor regret. It was the quieter unease of a woman who prides herself on foresight and discovers, too late, that the road ahead has altered its direction. She lay still for a moment, listening to the house awaken, footsteps below, a door closing softly. The distant clatter of crockery, life continuing, orderly and predictable, and yet her thoughts returned, uninvited, to the Duke of Marroway. Not to his title nor his presence, but to the way his gaze had moved through the ballroom, not hungry, not arrogant, but assessing, as though he were not merely observing society, but measuring it, and as though he had found something of interest. She dismissed the thought with a practiced ease and rose, dressing with deliberate calm. Elowen did not allow herself indulgences before breakfast. Reflection, she believed, was best undertaken with a clear mind and a cup of tea. Downstairs, the morning room was already occupied. Clara sat near the window, her bonnet discarded beside her, cheeks flushed with excitement that had not dimmed overnight. "You're awake!" she exclaimed. "I thought you might still be resting." Elowen smiled. "The day waits for no one, least of all women with reputations." Clara laughed. "Mr. Halden called—" Elowen paused, fingers hovering over the teacup. "So early." "He left a note," Clara said quickly. "Perfectly proper. He wishes to call this afternoon." There it was. The first consequence. Elowen studied Clara, not critically, but carefully. The girl's happiness was genuine, bright and still fragile. "That is swift," Elowen said gently. "I know," Clara admitted, lowering her voice. "But is that not good?" Elowen chose her words with care. "Swiftness is not a fault, but it can be revealing." Clara's smile wavered, just slightly. Elowen softened her tone at once. "You are pleased, and that matters." Clara relaxed again. "I am." and Elowen told herself, firmly, that was enough. Later that afternoon, Ivy joined them, her expression far more guarded. "Captain Rowley has invited me to walk tomorrow," she said. "Hyde Park, in daylight, with witnesses." Elowen arched a brow, prudent. Ivy studied her. "You arranged that. I merely facilitated conversation. You steered it." Elowen met her gaze without apology. "Only toward what already existed." Ivy tilted her head. "Do you truly believe that?" The question lingered between them, heavier than Ivy likely intended. Before Elowen could reply, the footman announced a caller. "Mr. Ashford." Nathaniel entered with the ease of someone long familiar with the house. He greeted Clara warmly, exchanged a brief, knowing glance with Ivy, and then turned to Elowen. "May I steal you for a moment?" he asked. Elowen inclined her head. "Of course." They stepped into the adjoining sitting room. The door left politely ajar. Nathaniel wasted no time. "The Duke of Marroway called this morning," he said quietly. Elowen's composure held. "I imagine many dukes call many places." "This one asked questions." She met his eyes. "About you." The word settled with unexpected weight. "He has an interest in your talents," Nathaniel continued. "Your reputation as a woman of insight." Elowen's lips curved faintly. "How flattering." Nathaniel did not smile. "He has cousins, young ones, and ambitions." Elowen felt a ripple of irritation. "I am not a tool to be borrowed." "No," Nathaniel agreed softly. "But you have made yourself visible." She turned toward the window, sunlight glinting off the glass. Visibility had never frightened her, but suddenly it felt different. That evening, Mr. Holden arrived, charming, polished, and impeccably confident, too confident. Elowen watched from the edge of the room as he spoke with Clara, his compliments generous and his attention absolute. Others faded when he focused on her. It should have pleased Elowen. Instead, she noticed how often he spoke for Clara, how he guided her responses, how he laughed when she hesitated. The room grew warmer. Elowen intervened smoothly, steering the conversation towards safer ground. Mr. Holden adapted at once, too easily. Later, when he departed, Clara glowed. "He is wonderful," she said. "Is he not?" Elowen hesitated. She had built her confidence on certainty. Now certainty required caution. "He is attentive," Elowen said carefully. Clara's joy dimmed only a fraction. That night, Elowen lay awake longer than usual. Her thoughts returned not to the Duke, but to Nathaniel, to his patience, to his steady presence, to the question he had asked her in the ballroom. What would it feel like to be guided? She dismissed the thought again. She always did. But somewhere, quietly, the edges of her certainty had begun to soften, and London, she sensed, was watching. There is a peculiar moment in every woman's life when certainty, having served faithfully for years, begins to feel less like armor and more like habit. Elowen Hartley did not recognize the moment at once. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, disguised as restraint. She began by speaking less. At breakfast, she listened while Clara recounted Mr. Holden's letters, polite, frequent, and increasingly confident in tone. Elowen noticed the pattern, but did not interrupt it. During afternoon calls, she allowed Ivy to navigate conversations without intervention, even when a poorly chosen remark might have benefited from a gentle redirection. At evening gatherings, she stood slightly apart, observing without arranging. It was not withdrawal. It was something more deliberate. Society, however, noticed at once. "Miss Hartley seems quieter," one lady remarked with delicate concern. "Perhaps she is unwell," said another. Or worse, "Perhaps she has finally grown tired of managing everyone else." Elowen heard the comments with composed indifference. If anything, their surprise amused her. It was astonishing how quickly people grew accustomed to being guided. and how unsettled they became when the guidance ceased. Nathaniel noticed before anyone else. He always did. They walked together one morning along a quieter street near Bloomsbury, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Eloan's steps were unhurried, her gloved hands folded neatly before her. "You're letting things unfold," Nathaniel said at last. Eloan glanced at him. "Is that an accusation?" "No," he replied. "An observation." She nodded. "I find it instructive." "In what way?" "I am learning," she said slowly, "how often people mistake direction for care." Nathaniel smiled, not triumphantly, but with quiet warmth. "And how does it feel?" Eloan considered. "Uncomfortable. Growth often is." She huffed softly. "You sound unbearably wise." "I've had a good teacher." Her gaze flicked to him, surprised. Nathaniel met her eyes without flinching. Something in her chest tightened, not painfully, but insistently. That afternoon, the consequences she had avoided arrived regardless. Clara entered the sitting room pale and flustered, her usual brightness dimmed. "He spoke too soon," she said, voice trembling. "Mr. Alden." He spoke as though everything were already decided. Eloan's heart sank, not from guilt, but recognition. "What did you say?" she asked gently. "I laughed," Clara admitted, "because I did not know what else to do." Eloan closed her eyes briefly. She had orchestrated the beginning. She had not considered the ending. That evening, whispers followed them through Lady Farncombe's salon. A suggestion here, a glance there. Society did not accuse openly, it never did, but it speculated with enthusiasm. Eloan felt the weight of it keenly. She had believed she could shape affection without bearing responsibility for its fractures. Now she understood how naive that belief had been. Later, alone by the window, she watched the lamplighters move along the street below. Nathaniel joined her without announcement. "You look troubled," he said. "I am," she admitted. He waited. She exhaled. "I thought I understood people better than this." "You do," he said, "but understanding is not the same as permission." Eloan's throat tightened. For the first time, she wondered, not defensively, not dismissively, what she had missed while arranging the hearts of others, and for the first time she noticed the ache of something she had never named. Nathaniel stood beside her, close enough that she felt the warmth of him. He did not reach for her. He never did. And perhaps that was what unsettled her most. At this point, dear listener, society itself would like to lean closer and observe, because when a woman accustomed to certainty begins to question her own design, the consequences are rarely quiet. If you find yourself forming an opinion already, I must confess, I would love to read your thoughts. Eloan turned from the window. Tomorrow, she decided, she would speak less still and listen more. If silence could be learned, Eloan Hartley was determined to master it. She discovered, to her mild irritation, that listening required more effort than speaking ever had. It demanded restraint, of impulse, of instinct, of the small satisfaction that came from intervening just before a misstep. In previous weeks, she would have corrected a remark before it settled awkwardly in the air. Now, she allowed it to land. She watched what happened next. At a morning visit to Mrs. Bellamy's townhouse, a young lady spoke too eagerly of her expectations, and a gentleman responded with polite discomfort rather than admiration. Eloan noticed how the room adjusted itself, how sympathy gathered quietly around the young lady afterward, not through Eloan's direction, but through shared human understanding. At another gathering, Ivy disagreed openly with an older matron's opinion on marriage, calmly, respectfully, without Eloan's careful phrasing to soften the exchange. The result was not scandal, but surprise. And then, something rarer. Respect. Eloan felt something loosen inside her. Perhaps control had not been protection after all. Perhaps it had been avoidance. Her own days grew quieter. She took longer walks, read fewer letters. Declined invitations she would once have accepted eagerly, not from fatigue, but from an unfamiliar desire to feel rather than manage. Nathaniel accompanied her often, though he never imposed. They walked through Kensington Gardens one afternoon, fallen leaves gathering beneath their feet, the air sharp enough to wake the senses. "You are changing," he said, not unkindly. "I am noticing," Elowen replied. He smiled. "That may be the same thing." She glanced at him. "You make it sound inevitable." "Some changes are," he said, "especially the ones we resist longest." They paused near a quiet bench. Children laughed somewhere in the distance, their voices carrying on the breeze. Elowen sat. Nathaniel followed. For a time, neither spoke. It was Elowen who broke the silence. "Do you think," she said carefully, "that it is possible to misunderstand one's own heart?" Nathaniel did not answer at once. "Yes," he said finally, "especially when one is very skilled at understanding everyone else's." Her fingers tightened in her lap. She did not look at him. "I believed," she continued, "that distance granted clarity. And now, she said softly, "I wonder what it has cost me." Nathaniel turned toward her then, fully. "Elowen," he said gently, "clarity without closeness is only observation." She swallowed. She had always prided herself on observation. Yet suddenly, it felt incomplete. That evening, the cost revealed itself more plainly. Clara returned from an afternoon call subdued, her excitement replaced by confusion. "He spoke again as though everything were settled," Clara said, "as though my feelings were already decided." Elowen listened, truly listened. "And what do you feel?" she asked. Clara hesitated. "I do not know." The honesty of it struck Elowen sharply. "And then you must not be hurried into certainty," Elowen said quietly. "Not by him, not by anyone." Clara searched her face. "Even you." Elowen's chest tightened. "Especially not by me." The words felt like a confession. That night, Elowen sat alone in her room, candle burning low. She thought of every conversation she had guided, every affection she had nudged into place. She had believed herself generous. Now she saw the arrogance hidden inside that generosity. And worse, she saw what she had ignored, Nathaniel's patience, his steadiness, the way he had always waited, never pressing, never claiming. Love, she realized with a quiet ache, had not frightened her. Loss of control had. And in guarding herself so carefully, she had left a truth unacknowledged. The truth that some connections could not be arranged. They had to be entered. She extinguished the candle and lay awake longer than usual. Tomorrow, she knew, would not be comfortable, but for the first time, discomfort felt like honesty. The day began without drama, which Elowen Hartley took as a warning. London, she had learned, rarely announced its turning points with fanfare. They arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary mornings, polite conversations, and decisions that seemed reasonable until they were not. She dressed with care, but without deliberation, choosing simplicity over statement. A soft muslin gown, gloves she did not adjust twice, hair pinned neatly, without the usual attention to symmetry. It felt important, somehow, not to armor herself. At breakfast, Clara was subdued. Ivy was thoughtful. The household moved gently around them, as though sensing the fragility beneath the surface. A note arrived just after the tea was poured. Mr. Holden wished to speak with Elowen. Privately. The request was courteous. The implication was not. Elowen read the note once, then folded it with calm precision. "I will see him," she said. Ivy's eyes sharpened. "Are you certain?" Elowen met her cousin's gaze. "It is time." Mr. Holden arrived promptly, confidence intact, smile ready. He bowed, impeccable as ever, and accepted the seat Elowen indicated across from her in the small sitting room. He spoke first, as Elowen expected. "I wish to thank you," he said warmly. "Your guidance has been invaluable." Elowen inclined her head. "I am pleased Clara has felt supported." "Yes," he said, waving the sentiment aside. "And now, of course, matters progress." She waited. He leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. "I thought it best to speak with you before I speak with her." The fracture came swiftly. "Speak with her about what?" Elowen asked evenly. "About the future," he replied. "Expectations, timelines." Elowen's fingers curled in her lap. "Mr. Holden," she said, "have you asked Clara what she expects?" He smiled, patient, indulgent. "She will, in time, align with what is sensible." Something cold settled behind Elowen's ribs. "You mistake politeness for consent," she said quietly. His smile faltered, just slightly. "I beg your pardon." "You speak as though certainty is something you bestow," Elowen continued. "But affection is not an arrangement one finalizes without listening." Mr. Holden straightened. "You encouraged me." "I encouraged conversation," she replied, "not assumption." Silence stretched between them, tense and revealing. At last he stood. "I see," he said coolly. "Perhaps I misunderstood the nature of your involvement." Elowen rose as well. "Perhaps," she said, "you misunderstood the nature of Clara's." He bowed again, this time stiffly, and departed without further pleasantries. Elowen remained standing long after the door closed. The fracture had formed, not loudly, but unmistakably. She found Clara in the garden later, seated beneath the bare branches of an old tree, hands folded tightly in her lap. Elowen sat beside her without speaking. After a moment, Clara whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Elowen said immediately. "You did something honest." Clara's eyes filled. "I do not know what I want yet." Elowen placed her hand gently over Clara's. "Then you must not be made to feel that you should." The relief on Clara's face was quiet but profound. Later still, Elowen walked alone. She passed familiar streets, familiar houses, familiar faces, yet everything felt altered, as though she had stepped slightly out of alignment with the world she once navigated so effortlessly. She realized then that she could not return to who she had been. The fracture had widened. That evening, Nathaniel found her in the small library, standing before a shelf she did not truly see. "You spoke with him," he said. "Yes." "And?" She turned to face him. "I chose honesty," she said, "even though it may cost me influence." Nathaniel studied her with something like pride. "And how does that feel?" She exhaled slowly. "Terrifying." He smiled softly. "And?" "Right." The word lingered between them, fragile and luminous. Nathaniel did not reach for her, but this time Elowen wished he would. There is a peculiar bravery in restraint. Elowen Hartley discovered this not in bold declarations, nor in dramatic defiance of society's expectations, but in the simple, aching effort of allowing herself to remain still when instinct urged her to intervene. The fracture she had created by choosing honesty did not close, it widened, and through it truth began to surface. Invitations arrived as usual, yet carried a different tone. Conversations paused more often when she entered a room. People watched her not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Miss Hartley, it seemed, was no longer directing the dance. She was part of it. At Lady Harrington's luncheon, a remark went unanswered where Elowen would once have smoothed it over. The silence that followed was awkward, but not disastrous. Someone else spoke. The moment passed. Elowen felt a strange relief. The world, it appeared, did not collapse without her guidance. Nathaniel accompanied her home that afternoon. The sky hung low and grey, London wrapped in a muted hush that suited her mood. "You are letting go," he observed. She gave a faint smile. "I am discovering how tightly I held on." They walked a few steps in silence. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Elowen considered carefully. "No, but I regret how long it took me to see why I held on at all." He did not press her further. That evening, the consequence she had half expected, half dreaded arrived. A letter. The Duke of Marroway requested her presence at a small gathering, informal, private, and unmistakably deliberate. Elowen read the note twice. The Duke was a man of influence. His interest carried weight, social, political, and personal. Once, she would have welcomed the opportunity, seeing it as confirmation of her insight and reputation. Now, she felt only caution. Nathaniel stood nearby, watching her expression shift. "You need not go," he said quietly. She folded the letter. "No, but I should." He studied her, searching. "For him?" "For myself," she replied. The gathering was restrained, elegant without ostentation. The Duke received her with courteous warmth, his manner respectful, his attention unmistakable. "You have a gift," he said as they spoke. "People trust your judgment." She met his gaze steadily. "Trust is not a thing one borrows lightly." His smile sharpened with interest. "Nor is influence." Elowen understood then what he wanted. Not her affection, her control. She declined his suggestion with calm clarity, careful not to wound, but firm enough to leave no confusion. When she returned home, her hands trembled not from fear, but from release. Nathaniel was waiting. "You said no," he said, reading her without question. "Yes." He smiled, gentle, proud, and something more tender still. Later, when the house had grown quiet, Elowen sat alone with her thoughts. For the first time, she allowed herself to name what she had long avoided. Love was not chaos, it was risk, and she had been avoiding risk with remarkable skill. She thought of Nathaniel, of his patience, his listening, his refusal to claim what she had not yet been able to offer. The realization settled slowly, unmistakably. She had not missed love because she was blind. She had missed it because she had been afraid to enter it. Tomorrow, she knew, something would change. Because once a woman recognizes the shape of her own fear, she can no longer pretend it does not exist. Courage, Elowen Hartley discovered, did not arrive with certainty. It arrived with hesitation. The morning after her refusal of the Duke's offer, she woke with the strange sensation of standing at the edge of something unnamed. Nothing in her surroundings had changed. The same pale light filtered through the curtains, the same quiet rhythms of the house continued, but within her a subtle reordering was underway. She dressed more slowly than usual, not from indecision, but from awareness. Every choice felt newly weighted, as though she were learning to move without the familiar support of distance. At breakfast, she spoke little. Clara appeared calmer than she had in days, her conversation lighter, her laughter returning in small, tentative bursts. Ivy observed Elowen closely, as if sensing the shift. "You look different," Ivy remarked at last. Elowen met her gaze. "Do I?" "You look," Ivy said carefully, "present." The word lingered with unexpected force. Later, Elowen and Nathaniel walked together toward the river. The Thames moved steadily beside them, indifferent to hesitation, untroubled by doubt. "I declined him," Elowen said, breaking the silence. Nathaniel nodded. "I know." She glanced at him. "You are not surprised." "I am relieved," he admitted. Her steps slowed. "For yourself?" she asked. "For you," he said simply. They stopped near the railing, the grey water reflecting the low sky. Elowen rested her hands against the cool metal. "I spent years believing closeness weakened judgment," she said, "that if I stepped too near, I would lose myself. And now, she continued, voice steady but soft, "I see that distance did not protect me. It only kept me from being known." Nathaniel turned toward her fully. "I have known you," he said gently. Even when you stood apart? Her throat tightened. Yes, she replied, but you never asked to be let in. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes deepened. That was not my choice to make. The truth of it struck her with clarity. She had controlled the tempo of every connection in her life, except this one. They resumed walking, closer now, not by intention, but by inclination. At a small bookshop near the Strand, Elowen paused. She had not entered in years. "May we?" she asked. Nathaniel smiled. "Always." Inside, the scent of paper and dust wrapped around them. Elowen wandered the shelves, her fingers tracing familiar spines. Nathaniel watched her with quiet fondness. "You used to come here when we were children," he said. "You would sit in the corner and pretend not to listen to the world." She laughed softly. "And you would bring me tea I did not ask for, but accepted anyway." She turned to him then. "I did," she said. "I always did." The realization struck her fully, unexpectedly. She had never truly refused him. She had simply never acknowledged what acceptance meant. They left the shop with a single book between them. That evening, Elowen stood alone in her room, holding the book but not reading. She thought of all the times Nathaniel had been near, without demanding, present without insisting. Love, she understood now, was not a force that demanded surrender. It was an invitation, and she had been standing at the threshold for years. Tonight, she would not step away. Elowen Hartley had always believed that declarations were loud things. They arrived, she assumed, with raised voices or trembling hands, with words rehearsed and hearts laid bare in dramatic fashion. Society encouraged this belief. It thrived on spectacle, on moments that could be retold with embellishment. What Elowen discovered instead was far more unsettling. The most honest admissions arrived quietly. She felt it the following morning, as she poured tea and realized she was listening for footsteps she had never before waited for. She felt it when she read a line in her book and understood it not as an idea, but as a mirror. She felt it in the subtle shift of her own posture, shoulders no longer held in careful readiness, but softened, as though some private vigil had ended. Elowen was no longer standing guard over her heart. She was standing beside it. That afternoon, she found Nathaniel in the small courtyard behind the house, seated with a ledger open across his knee. He looked up at once, as though he had expected her. "May I interrupt?" she asked. He smiled. "You never interrupt." She joined him, resting her hands lightly on the back of the chair across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. It was Elowen who broke the silence. "I have been thinking," she said. His brow lifted slightly. "That is rarely a safe beginning." She smiled faintly. "I have been thinking about how often I spoke around my feelings rather than from them." Nathaniel closed the ledger, giving her his full attention. And I am beginning to understand that distance was never clarity," she continued. "It was avoidance dressed in composure." She met his gaze, fully this time. "I do not wish to observe any more." The words hung between them, unadorned. Nathaniel's voice was low. "What do you wish, then?" She inhaled, steadying herself, not with certainty but with resolve. "I wish to listen," she said, "and to be heard. Even when I am uncertain." His expression softened in a way that made her chest ache. "I have always listened," he said, "but I would be honored to be heard." They sat together as the afternoon waned, speaking of small things, books, walks, moments from their shared past that now carried new weight. There was no confession, no claim, only recognition. That evening, Elowen attended a modest gathering alone. She moved through the room differently, not assessing, not arranging, but feeling. When someone sought her guidance, she offered questions instead of answers. When silence appeared, she did not rush to fill it. And when she left, she did so without the familiar exhaustion of control. At home, she paused at her writing desk and picked up a pen. She began a letter, then set it aside. Some things, she realized, did not belong on paper. They belonged in presence. Tomorrow, she would speak plainly, not to orchestrate, but to stand alongside. There are moments in life when change is no longer a private matter. It announces itself, not loudly, but unmistakably, through posture, through choice, through the quiet confidence of a woman who has stopped rehearsing her escape. Elowen Hartley woke that morning with a clarity that surprised her. Not certainty, clarity. She knew what she felt, and more importantly, she knew she would no longer pretend otherwise. The house felt different to her now, not because its walls had shifted, but because she no longer felt the need to brace herself against them. Breakfast passed with gentle conversation. Clara laughed more freely than she had in weeks. Ivy caught Elowen's eye once, smiling as though she understood more than was being said. "You look lighter," Ivy remarked. Elowen smiled. "I feel honest." That honesty carried her through the morning, through a brief visit from a well-meaning acquaintance who hinted, too transparently, at advantageous matches still available to her. Elowen listened politely, thanked her, and changed the subject without apology. It was a small rebellion, but a meaningful one. By afternoon, the sky had softened into a pale grey, the kind that made London feel quieter than it truly was. Elowen wrapped herself in a shawl and walked, alone this time, toward the familiar path near the river. She knew he would be there, not because she had arranged it, but because he always was. Nathaniel stood near the railing, hands folded loosely, gaze resting on the slow movement of the Thames. He turned as she approached, his expression open, unguarded. "Elowen," he said. She stopped beside him, close enough that their sleeves brushed. "I will not speak around this," she said softly. "I will not manage it, or soften it, or delay it." He said nothing. He listened. "I have spent years believing that love required oversight," she continued, "that it was safest when observed, when guided, when kept at a proper distance." Her voice did not tremble. "But I was wrong." Nathaniel's breath shifted, barely perceptible. "I was not afraid of love," she said. "I was afraid of being known within it." She turned to face him fully now. "And you," she said quietly, "have known me anyway." Silence stretched between them, not heavy, but reverent. Nathaniel's voice, when it came, was steady but thick with emotion. "I never wished to be chosen because you needed me," he said, "only because you saw me." Her eyes burned. "I see you," she said. "I always have." I simply refused to look at what that meant. He did not reach for her at once. He waited, and in that waiting, she understood something essential. This was not conquest. This was consent. Elowen took the final step herself. She rested her hand over his, not clinging, not tentative, but present. "I cannot promise certainty," she said, "but I can promise honesty and listening and the courage to stay." Nathaniel's fingers closed around hers, warm and sure. "That," he said, "is all I have ever wanted." They did not kiss. They did not need to. What passed between them was quieter, deeper, a recognition that did not require witnesses. And yet, dear listener, society has a way of sensing such moments even when they unfold without spectacle. One may be certain that rumors will follow, interpretations will bloom, and opinions will form, because nothing unsettles London more than a woman who chooses her own heart. If you find yourself smiling at this development, or perhaps questioning it, I must confess. They walked back together, unhurried, steps aligned not by design but by trust. Tomorrow would bring conversations, expectations, change. But tonight, Elowen Hartley had stepped forward, and she did not intend to step back. Resolution, Elowen Hartley learned, did not feel like triumph. It felt like steadiness. The morning after her quiet admission by the river arrived without ceremony. No bells rang, No letters appeared bearing dramatic news. The city moved as it always had, carriages rolling, shopkeepers opening shutters, society preparing itself for another day of polite performance, and yet Elowen moved through it differently. She was no longer braced. At breakfast, Clara spoke of Mr. Holden with a clarity that had been absent before. The excitement was gone, replaced by thoughtfulness. "I have written to him," Clara said. "I asked for time." Elowen met her cousin's eyes. "And how did that feel?" "Terrifying," Clara admitted, "but also relieving." Elowen smiled. "Then it was the right thing." Ivy watched the exchange with quiet approval. "You have changed," Ivy said later, as they lingered near the window. "Yes," Elowen replied, "and so have you." They shared a look of mutual recognition, one woman no longer directing, the other no longer waiting to be guided. That afternoon, Elowen received visits, well-meaning acquaintances, curious observers, one subtle inquiry after another, each designed to discover whether Miss Hartley was still available, still influential, still predictable. She answered them all with grace and with boundaries. When Nathaniel arrived later, he did so without announcement, as he always had. But this time, Elowen rose to meet him. They walked together through the familiar streets, not toward any particular destination, but with shared intention. "You are very quiet," he observed. "I am content," she replied. He smiled. "That may be your most radical change yet." They paused near a modest square. Children playing nearby, the sound of laughter light against the stone buildings. "I once believed," Elowen said slowly, "that love required management, that without oversight it became disorder." "And now?" Nathaniel asked. "And now I understand," she said, turning to face him, "that love is not something to stand ahead of." She met his gaze steadily. "It is something to walk beside." Nathaniel's expression softened, not with surprise, but with recognition long awaited. He reached for her hand, openly this time, and she did not hesitate. Their fingers intertwined naturally, without urgency or hesitation. Society would notice soon enough. They always did. But when whispers came, and they would, Elowen knew she would meet them without retreat, without defense. She had not surrendered herself. She had claimed herself. That evening, as lamplight warmed the room and the city settled into its nocturnal hush, Elowen reflected, not with regret, but with clarity. She had believed herself strong because she stood apart. She was stronger now because she stood present. Love had not altered her nature. It had revealed it, and in choosing vulnerability, she had not lost control. She had gained connection. Some hearts do not fear love itself, but what love requires of them. Elowen's journey reminds us that understanding others is not the same as understanding ourselves, and that control, when mistaken for wisdom, can quietly distance us from the very connection we desire. True love does not demand perfection, certainty, or mastery. It asks only for honesty, presence, and the courage to be known. If this story touched you, comforted you, or made you reflect on your own journey, I would love for you to stay a while. Subscribe for more timeless romances like this story. If it stirred your heart, share it with someone who loves classic love stories and leave a comment. Your thoughts mean more than you know. Thank you for walking beside this story.